Yeah, as Erica mentioned, we're kind of coming to the tail end of this commission to create an advocacy toolkit. It's been, I think, really exciting for us that we made that to kind of look at kind of building the case for culture for different audiences and kind of doing a deep dive into the regional context. So happy to kind of share some of the thinking on that with you. But yeah, really this toolkit is intended to help engage a range of stakeholders on the sort of strategic power of cultural compacts and culture. The toolkits we've been developing in collaboration with the Compacts Plus network build a structured approach to sustained advocacy. So while some of this relates kind of directly to how compacts might engage with different stakeholders, there are some sort of wider wraparound pieces that come into this that I think might be particularly useful for the group here to follow. Are you seeing me change slides? Great. So a quick note about what we mean when we're talking about toolkits here. I know lots of people use this word in lots of different ways, but really what we're talking about is kind of two different components. One is a how-to guide, which provides some sort of tips about how to engage with different stakeholders and also sets out kind of practically how to use the slide decks. And then there's also kind of a glossary of often used sort of cultural terms that come up that may not be familiar to all audiences. There are then 5 different slide decks which speak to different audiences, and I'll kind of go into who these are in a bit more detail in a minute here. But I think what's important to say is that these cover both sort of why culture is important to these audiences, and then also what can come from sort of collaborating with compacts to drive culture in places. And so for our purposes today, I think what's most interesting to talk about might be a bit more the sort of why culture for these audiences and the language and the key messages that we're hoping to land with them. But we'll also kind of hopefully have time for a few questions at the end if you want to learn more about the rest. So I think just first important to share some of the background research that's gone into this. So together with the Compacts Plus network, we've sort of gathered research about the state of culture kind of nationally, also from our experience elsewhere in the UK, and then also kind of for the West Midlands region. Important to note as well that we know that a lot of the existing data we have, particularly sort of like aggregated jobs and things like that, are speaking to the West Midlands Combined Authority region, and that maybe misses out some of the important geographies. We're aware of that, and I think when we go into the sort of case studies, it's a bit easier to deep dive into local places. But culture contributes 2.3 million jobs in the creative industries across the UK. So we're talking about culture not just as a source of entertainment and enrichment, but also a vital driver of economic growth and social well-being. 1 in 8 businesses part of the creative industries, so this generates substantial employment opportunities, contributing to lower employment rates and kind of overall economic activity. And 109 billion pounds contributed to the UK economy by the creative sector in 2021. So this means that kind of cultural and creative sectors were contributing 5.6 to the UK economy that year. Looking at the West Midlands, 4 billion of gross value added generated by the creative industries. So actually combined, that's bigger than construction, life sciences, healthcare, logistics, transport technologies, and low carbon and environmental technology. It's the 3rd largest cultural sector in the UK after London and Greater Manchester. And it saw 20% employment growth in the years prior to COVID. So as the 2nd fastest growing sector, it sort of has a historic and future potential. Thinking about the kind of volume of events that culture brings to the region. So 700 events, as an example, hosted by Coventry for UK City of Culture, that this happens in over 2,000 spaces that host and support cultural activities. So we know that there's a lot of places where this is happening and potentially some room for growth in things like creative open workspaces, which I'll get to in a minute. But we also know that kind of many people also have limited access to publicly funded cultural activities, which I think everyone here will be familiar with as well. And that there's a kind of a need for investment for equitable access regionally. Looking towards the future, the sector has a 20% higher growth rate compared to the national rate. We've seen 3 growth zones in the West Midlands region, which kind of creates an opportunity to marry economic goals with sort of cultural activities and infrastructure. And there have been kind of 9 cultural action zones identified across the region as well. We've looked at kind of the funding landscape for culture regionally, including kind of national government funding, leveling up funding, but then also kind of different arts council avenues for funding. We know that the region is quite a young one, which creates kind of specific opportunities for where culture can create opportunities for young people, and that it's a growing population. West Midlands is growing faster than the UK as a whole, which may be an important thing to point out for some of the stakeholders that you're engaging. And we've also, in 2022 or 2023, we mapped cultural infrastructure across the West Midlands Combined Authority region. So have quite a lot of information about how volume of space has changed, what some of the specific spatial needs are, and kind of what those challenges are, which have gone into some of this engagement work. So thinking more specifically about how some of this research and messaging lands across different audiences, we've worked with the Compacts Plus network to define kind of the most important, the priority audiences to kind of engage on culture, and I think particularly around securing funding and other kind of support for culture. And the 5 different audiences that we've identified and that we've looked towards are local authority stakeholders. So that includes everything from sort of chief exec and above, even elected members. Property developers, so kind of both private residential and commercial developers, and then also housing trusts. So thinking about how kind of why property developers should embed culture in development and how to partner with cultural compacts to achieve impact in doing so. We've thought about the importance of engaging public health stakeholders. So that might be local authority departments, but also Public Health England, clinical commissioning groups, NHS trusts, and even the VCS. So how can we leverage kind of increasing evidence for the value of culture for kind of physical and mental health and health outcomes there. And then philanthropists, so thinking about how kind of financial support from both individual philanthropists, foundations, corporate philanthropy officers, community foundations, kind of how might we get new potential philanthropic partners on board, but also how compacts can help direct effective funding from different types of philanthropists. And then finally, thinking about business. So that might be for individual businesses, kind of anchor businesses in certain places. They're sort of corporate social responsibility officers, but then also chambers of commerce, bids, thinking about more the economic case for why partnering with compacts is good business. So I think we won't go through, of course, all of the slides for all of these different audiences, but I can run through kind of what some of the headline messaging and kind of important considerations for each of these audiences are. Before I go through this, does anyone have a question? Might pause for questions here. No?
Can't see anyone with any hands up, so.
Okay. Great.
If
I
any
can't.
people just have any questions as you're going along, pop them in the chat maybe.
Yeah, sounds good. Or just give a shout and I can pause. So thinking about speaking to property developers. So this might be sort of commercial property developers, residential. Of course, and unsurprisingly, I think one of the main things you're going to have to speak to is the real estate value that culture can bring. And there is kind of increasing evidence that creative clusters in particular are outperforming area averages in terms of real estate values. But I think important as well as we've been putting these together is thinking about the other things that that developers are looking for. So creative workspace actually isn't really introducing much risk in particular to kind of property investors and developers and also can help secure long-term income in different ways. And then there's also a kind of range of considerations around how creative spaces, particularly creative spaces included in residential and commercial development, are seen increasingly favorably by sort of local planning authorities. So these are some of the kind of key benefits that we'll pull out in that particular toolkit. Thinking about public health stakeholders. So of course, it's going to be important to land how arts and culture can have sort of specific health benefits. And there is a kind of growing body of research on that, and actually even West Midlands specific research. I think particularly important in this moment are speaking to the impacts on social isolation and loneliness, and improving sort of well-being. And in many of the kind of studies that we've looked at, engagement with the arts kind of has correlation with decreased consultation rates and reduced hospital admissions, which are going to be important things for kind of any of the public health stakeholders that you're engaging. And there are some ways to speak about that in terms of kind of actual NHS savings. So one study saw 216 pounds of savings per patient annually. Thinking about the sort of landscape of philanthropy. So we know that only 1% of the 12.7 billion given of philanthropic donation in 2022 was given to arts and cultural organizations. And 88 million of that was from sort of major trusts and foundations. We also know that there are four trusts responsible for 75% of grant expenditure. So any sort of change in how these trusts are giving, and this may be something that people here have experienced as well, will have kind of really large impacts on individual organizations. And thinking about how many funders are currently looking to spend down, so spending large amounts of money kind of in the short term, looking for sort of shorter term impact. It will be important to be able to speak to kind of the kind of short-term and immediate impacts, but balancing that with the legacy that a lot of philanthropists are kind of looking to secure. And I think some of the kind of social and economic case that's made to other audiences may also be kind of useful to bring into these conversations. Then thinking about kind of businesses and corporate stakeholders, I think unsurprisingly, the sort of economic case for culture, both kind of nationally and at a local level, will be really important to land with these audiences. A lot of the kind of successful pitches to these kind of audiences are talking about culture as a success story, the kind of growth, particularly driving things like footfall and spend in local areas. These will be kind of important themes to cover. But I think increasingly businesses are recognizing the benefits of kind of more active local engagement. So thinking about how engagement with particularly local cultural activities can enhance reputation, help drive innovation and secure sustainable growth within local communities will also be important to cover in these in these conversations. And then the last one here, before I pass off to Eve, is the kind of local authority audiences. So we know that local and regional governments are recognizing the need for a vibrant, inclusive, funded, and active cultural offering. And sort of different local authorities may be engaged with this at kind of different levels. And really important to these conversations, we'll be talking about sort of both the social and the economic value that culture can bring to places. So again, speaking to how culture can help aid well-being, provide employment, and then particularly attracting visitor and spend to towns and cities and countrysides will be part of these conversations. I think our last couple of slides here go into this in a bit more detail. So showing how kind of in the local authority context, we've used case studies to help make these points. Eve, would you like to speak through these?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Lily provided a really good overview of kind of those key big thematic areas. And underneath those, as she just mentioned, we have kind of a series of case studies to really kind of bring out some of those key stats and figures and numbers that typically tend to kind of resonate with people. We didn't want to hit you with all of them at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, but we have kind of provided a bit of a bank that people can kind of draw on and say, oh, this is a really good case study that I want to talk about. And so as part of this work, we've looked at kind of economic and social value, diving into these things a little bit deeper. And here is just one example of the slides that we've kind of put together. So this basically shows how culture supports local high streets and economic centers by creating a diversity of use with increased visitor offer and activation of place, driving footfall, increasing perceptions of safety and economic activity, and also confidence for businesses to invest. So a couple kind of examples that we've pulled out here that show the economic value that culture can bring to an area is increased footfall and local spend. So the Stoke-on-Trent annual High Street Art Festival, the Big Feast, attracted 15,495 participants and increased footfall to the high street by 20% above a typical weekend average. So really kind of footfall, economic spend, sense of community really started to kind of catalyze some activity in the area. Culture can also lead to decreased vacancy rates. So the Glassworks in Barnsley is a culture-led regeneration project that is led by the council, and it's currently running at 88% capacity, which surpasses the national average of 81% capacity. 3 of the units, the vacant units in this building, transformed into cultural spaces, offering arts, digital, and community services, and those were fully occupied after a 12-month residency. So it kind of shows the value that culture can bring to securing that space for the long term. Culture also has been proven to increase economic activity. So within the West Midlands Combined Authority region, cultural tourism generates 2.3 billion in visitor expenditure. The Shrewsbury Food Festival is one example where it attracts 30,000 people annually. So it provides a boost to the local economy just from that one weekend. So a lot of increased economic activity. Of course, linking with things like footfall as well, but cultural activities can generate quite a lot for the local area. And also culture as a way to leverage additional funding and investment. So 172.6 million was secured through Coventry being awarded the UK City of Culture. And this money then kind of gets filtered into other parts of the economy and going to kind of different groups and really starting to kind of show that economic the importance of kind of having that local economy and what culture can do for that. So a lot of economic value that culture can contribute to a place. And as Lily mentioned, there's also social value, which is the next slide, Lily. So in each of these, we also know that numbers don't mean everything. While they're an easy way to kind of communicate the value that's generated by culture, it's really important to kind of look at other factors that may not be as quantifiable. So we have things that kind of relate more towards the social value of space. So culture, for example, provides hubs for people to go to interact with each other, share cultural ideas, access educational opportunities, and learn more about important topics. Many of the spaces and participatory programming are open to all and can enable people who would otherwise be excluded to enter into life in the community. It can tend to increase a sense of place, community, and civic pride, which then reduces social isolation, loneliness, and improves life satisfaction. So we've pulled out a few case studies here that directly relate to the social value that culture can bring. So higher life satisfaction is one of those values. And data from the UK's largest longitudinal household survey, Understanding Society, suggests that increased engagement in the arts, events, historical sites, and museums is associated with higher life satisfaction. Events like the Birmingham Museum's Day Out with the Kids encourage increased engagement in the arts and culture. We also know that culture can increase educational attainment. So participation in structured art activities, such as the Seven Arts program, for example, can increase cognitive abilities by 17%. Learning through arts and culture can improve attainment across all subjects and helps develop skills and behavior that lead children to be better in school. We also know that culture leads to decreased feelings of isolation and loneliness. So visiting museums, arts, and heritage site has the potential to reduce feelings of loneliness and isolation by giving older adults, for example, the opportunity to come together with others in spaces which spark contemplation and conversation. In Oxford, there is a program specifically at the Pitt Rivers Museum that does this for older adults. So there's also an opportunity for the West Midlands region to kind of learn from others as well. And finally, we know that culture leads to increased sense of collective identity. So local kind of activities create the space for interaction and shared experience, which leads to people having a stronger attachment to place. Birmingham's LGBT plus No Outsiders Family Festival is one example of how culture can unite diverse communities and foster a deeper sense of belonging. So each of these kind of more detailed slides sits behind those larger facts that Lily mentioned. And what we really want these kind of toolkits to be able to do is to kind of speak to those wider audiences and give them facts and figures to say, listen, this is why you should really take this seriously, work with us as a partnership, invest in culture and the arts. And yeah, because it brings all of these kind of different types of values. So I'll pause there. I think there's a question in the chat which we can also pick up. So may I ask, is there a standard financial metric that could be used in terms of speaking with various stakeholders? I think, no, I don't think it's as easy as kind of, there's one specific way of communicating. I think gross value add is something that a lot of people know, but I think that's one of the kind of purposes of these toolkits is to be able to tailor what is communicated to each of those different audiences. So that would be my answer to that question. But yeah, happy to kind of have a discussion. Be really keen to have your thoughts. Is there anything that stood out to you? Is there anything that you think we should explore more? Yeah.
Anybody? Neil?
I was slightly astonished by, I probably shouldn't be, by that stat that only 1% of philanthropic giving goes to the arts. I think we all know how hard it is to raise funds, but gosh, we're so far behind, aren't we? I mean, where are we fundamentally losing out to? Sciences, art, university, you know, is what's behind that number?
Yeah, I can share the report that came from in the chat separately, but I think that, yeah, it's mostly kind of education, science, health is a big one. And I think that kind of speaks to the importance of being able to be really clear about kind of the impacts that culture can have in these areas, in order to kind of drive that giving. We were also thinking about kind of philanthropy specifically with regards to cultural infrastructure, and building. And for I think the figure for philanthropy that goes towards kind of architectural projects it's 0.01%. So wider culture is kind of winning out there, but there's definitely a lot of further case making and to be made.
Sarah. Sarah, have you got your hand up?
Yeah,
Sorry.
thanks. Sorry, just trying to mute myself. In terms of these stats that you're talking about, have they changed significantly in the last 20-25 years, or are we sort of tracking? I'm just always interested to understand any significant shifts and how much, you know, we all have to balance how much time we spend going down these different routes. And I'm not suggesting that it's not a worthwhile thing to keep challenging these things. Of course it is. That's what we all do. But to balance that off, is there any information to suggest that we're making headway in any of this by continuing to collate all of this information and share? Has anything improved on the landscape?
Lily, do you want me to start here? Or do you want to?
I think, yeah, Eve, maybe you.
I was going to say it. I think in full transparency, for the purposes of this research that we've been doing, we haven't necessarily looked at that as a specific point. However, from the wider work that we've been doing, we know that it's kind of a mixed bag. I think there are areas where we know that things are working. For example, you have kind of new sorts of funding packages from the government. You have kind of a greater attention from local councils to understand how culture can kind of impact various different types of areas. So how it relates to education, how it relates to health, and you're starting to kind of see those conversations more. I think it's not, like I said, on the one hand, things are changing, but on the other hand, it's not enough. And I think that's almost where we could potentially look into more and say, where are the gaps still, and why isn't it going further? And if there was further investment, like what could that do? So I think on the one hand, it is some things are changing, but on the other hand, we're still, needing a bit of work. I don't know, Lily, did you have anything that you wanted to
Yeah,
add?
I guess I would just add that where we have seen change, and like we do kind of have experienced seeing changes, particularly with regards to raising awareness of the value of spaces for culture. So a lot of times kind of different stakeholders, I would say in the past 10 years, we've seen a really big change in the awareness that everyone from kind of local authorities to sort of national government have had around spaces, specifically spaces for culture, and looking at the full sort of cultural value chain. And we've seen, I guess, an encouraging increase in kind of awareness and talking about the impact of these spaces and investment in them as that's grown. So for us, that feels like evidence that, you should keep talking about it to people and bringing new people in.
I think one final point on that too is there's been kind of increased studies as well. So there's a policy and evidence center that's been doing a lot of work around the creative industries, cultural corridors, clusters, creative clusters, and really starting to kind of bring out the evidence of like, what does it mean for cultural and creative industries to cluster in a specific area? How does that influence the economy? How does that influence kind of the way that people work together in partnership? And there's a lot of interesting things coming out of there. So yeah, I think with the more evidence that's being drawn out, we're continuously seeing the benefits of it. But there's still a way to go, right? It's not saying that everything's perfect, but I do think, as Lily said, it's the values being recognized more. And so I think we need to continue to shout about it.
Peter, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, So two quick comments from me. I think one, just going back to the 1% thing, that also did strike me hugely. And within that context, I don't know, we worry, I think it's a sector that we're often seen as a bit needy. And actually 1% maybe just reframed that very slightly in the way that we kind of should be confident, I guess. I know we are. The second question was, and I know you haven't shared the full deck of slides, was whether there's more in there or could be more in there around cultural and what's happening within the schools environments and how that's dropping off hugely. I mean, I know within the music sector, we're seeing the rates of students that are taking music to GCSE and to A-level drop off a cliff. And that's coming down the line to us in terms of who is going to be working in the creative industries in the future. And of course, massively around the equality of opportunity and access issues. And so that might be slightly outside the remit of what you're doing. I'm not sure, but I just wanted to kind of ask about that.
Do you want me to come back on that, Lily? Or
Sure. Yeah, go ahead. I can.
yeah,
follow up.
it's slightly outside of the scope of what we've said. We had to kind of pick some sectors that we thought were kind of priorities for the compact about a sort of investment, and education wasn't quite there in that respect. However, obviously, there's loads of a lot of the things that came out of the summit, and member advocacy work's probably going to be focused on education as well. And I know we're kind of thinking about what that looks like, and it's interesting to see potential Labour manifesto around supporting education, creative education as well going forward. There was a question in the chat, I don't know if you've seen it, where was the best place to track the evidence, read the cultural value of cultural clusters?
I'm popping that in the chat now.
Thanks.
I'm putting there's two blog posts which I think are a little bit more accessible, and there's links to the full reports in those blog reports if you want some light, not so light reading, but yeah, they're quite interesting.
Thanks. Has anybody else got any questions, comments? No. Excellent. That was really interesting. Lily, do you want to, Mark? You always, I say no, and then Mark's always there. You're on mute, Mark.
Hi. It's because I don't know how to use the machinery. But I just want to say that was great. Really, really inspiring, and the sort of thing we ought to read on those dull days when we think things are just awful. Actually having really solid evidence that's so credible does make a difference. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Glad to hear it. I think we certainly feel hopeful, and I hope that this can be a useful tool for all of you as well. So next steps from us on this are that we'll sort of publish, or we'll kind of hand these over to Culture Central in kind of end of May, all 5 decks and the how-to guide, as well as a sort of guide for how to use them. And I think Erica may be the one to get in touch with about kind of seeing more of those.
We'll be doing some short sharing and talking about it. Obviously, the compacts are the kind of first people to see the full slide decks that we've been working with, and just to be clear, it is predominantly for them to kind of do that work. But obviously, it's really useful for us all to have those. If we're all having the same messages, the same sort of approaches to those values, then the more that people remember that in their head, don't they? So sometimes just those things are really helpful.